Hi, my name's Nigel Mullings. I'm a cloud solution architect for Ingram Micro Cloud, and today I'll be talking to you about Microsoft's Identity and Access Management Service, better known as Azure AD. So what is Azure AD? Azure Active Directory is Microsoft's multi-tenant, cloud-based identity and access management service, which can help your employees sign in and access cloud-based external resources, such as Microsoft 365, the Azure portal, and thousands of other software as a service applications. Internal on-prem resources, such as apps on your corporate network and intranet, along with any cloud apps developed by your own organization internally. Azure AD is a leading provider of cloud-based identity as a service, or IDaaS, and provides a broad range of capabilities for enterprise organizations, such as multi-factor authentication, single sign-on. Azure Active Directory supports more than 2,800 pre-integrated software as a service applications. This graphic shows an example of a hybrid identity solution that enables IT admins to manage and integrate their current Windows Server Active Directory solution located on premises with Microsoft's Azure Active Directory to enable users to use single sign-on across applications located in the cloud and on-prem. Integrating your identities with Microsoft Cloud provides a broad range of services and applications. Azure Active Directory integration provides identity management for applications across all categories of Microsoft Cloud, so SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS. Consolidated identity management for third-party cloud apps in your portfolio. Collaboration with partners using Azure AD B2C and B2B. Management of those customer identities. Integration with web-based apps located on-prem. For line of business applications hosted on virtual machines in Azure IaaS, you can use domain services in Azure, or you can extend your on-prem Windows Server Active Directory environment. And we'll have a look at an on-prem AD extended to Azure in a video demo shortly. To better understand how Azure Active Directory can help organizations secure identities in the cloud, let's take a quick look at some of today's identity challenges. So we have our resources, and those resources could be anywhere. They could be on-prem resources, they could be in a partner's cloud, they could be in a public cloud, SaaS apps, Office 365, they could be in our own private cloud. And essentially, we have our user, and the user wants to gain access to those resources from any device. We often need scenarios where we have multi-hop going on. We need scenarios where we have a server acting on behalf of a user, using the user's identity to carry on doing something when the user's no longer present. So how do we do it? Well, we can bring Azure AD to the rescue. We need federated protocols to make this work, and there are a number of federated protocols. Here we're using Azure AD, which is our tenant, our directory, and inside our tenant, we manage our data. And we don't need to worry about the underlying infrastructure, which is managed by Microsoft. There are currently two portals. The classic portals, soon to be retired. We can use PowerShell, we can use Graph, and essentially synchronize our on-prem users into Azure Active Directory. Once we do that, we can take advantage of those federated protocols, and we can now go out to a whole raft of applications. Who uses Azure AD? IT admins. As an IT admin, you can use Azure AD to control access to your apps and your app resources based on your business requirements. For example, you can use Azure Active Directory to require multi-factor authentication when accessing important organizational resources. Application developers. As an app developer, you can use Azure AD as a standards-based approach for adding single sign-on to your app, allowing it to work with users' pre-existing credentials. Azure Active Directory also provides APIs that can help you build personalized application experiences using existing organizational data. Microsoft 365, Office 365, Azure, or Dynamic CRM Online subscribers, as a subscriber, you're already using Azure AD. Each M365 or Office 365 Azure Dynamic CRM Online tenant is automatically an Azure AD tenant, so you can immediately start to manage access to your integrated cloud apps. What are the Azure AD license requirements? Microsoft Online Business Services such as Office 365 or Microsoft Azure require Azure AD for sign-in and to help with identity protection. If you subscribe to any Microsoft Online Business Service, you automatically get Azure AD with access to all the free features. To enhance your Azure AD implementation, you can also add paid capabilities by upgrading to Azure AD Premium P1 or Premium P2 licenses. Azure AD paid licenses are built on top of your existing free directory, providing self-service, enhanced monitoring, security reporting, and secure access for your mobile users. Let's take a look at the different editions of Azure Active Directory, some of the features and the associated costs. So the best way I found to look at pricing for a particular solution is to use the pricing by product option on the Microsoft documentation pages. So from here, if I select pricing by product, I can start to search for Active Directory and select Azure Active Directory. Takes me to the Azure Active Directory pricing page where I can see the 4 different editions: the free edition, Office 365 Apps Edition, Premium P1 and Premium P2 edition. So what you typically do is decide which features you need in your organization, and that will determine which edition of Azure AD you're going to want to deploy. So for example, I can see that the free edition gives me multi-factor authentication for administrator roles. But if I want multi-factor authentication for phones and SMS, I need the Office 365 edition. So that would be where I select a phone as a second method of authentication, or I can use an SMS text. So if you scroll down to the premium features, some of the premium features that are only available in P1 and P2, and the features that are only available in P2. So if, for example, you wanted risk events investigation feature, and you also wanted privileged identity management feature, you'd need to deploy the Premium 2 SKU edition. So the price for each of the editions: Premium P1 costs £4.47 per user per month, and Premium P2 costs £6.70 per user per month. How do we use it? Azure AD can be managed from the Azure portal, Azure command line interface, or PowerShell by running install module Azure AD. Before we jump into a video demonstration of Azure AD, I'd like to draw your attention to this best practice Microsoft reference architecture for integrating on-premise Active Directory domains with Azure Active Directory. And this will become a lot clearer in the demo. So what you have on the left-hand side is your on-prem network with a domain controller with all my users and objects on there, with another server with Azure AD Connect installed. Azure AD Connect server is syncing all my users from AD into Azure Active Directory. So now any of my users, external or on-prem, want to access any of my resources in the cloud, are forced to authenticate through Azure Active Directory. And I'll show you how to access this reference architecture, which can be deployed from the Microsoft documentation pages and other reference architectures that may be useful when deploying solutions in Azure prior to the demo. So here we are in the Azure portal. Before we jump into the demo, I just want to give you an overview of the environment so you can see what we're working with and set the scene for the demonstration. So I'm logged into Azure with my personal account. This is a free account that anyone can get from the Microsoft Azure pages. And this free account, I have a Visual Studio subscription, which gives me the Azure Active Directory Office 365 edition. So on here, I've pinned Azure Active Directory, and you can see NBM systems there. That's my own custom domain that I've brought in, and we'll have a quick look at that shortly. I've got a couple of virtual machines running, domain controllers. One of them is running Azure AD Connect. The other is my secondary failover domain controller. These are both running in Azure, and they're both running in UK South. If we have a quick look at virtual machines, you can see I've got 4 virtual machines in the subscription. For the purpose of the demo, we're going to be creating a user on-prem, synchronizing that user from on-prem domain services to Azure Active Directory, and giving that user access to manage these domain controllers in the environment. So we go back to the dashboard. I'll have a look at the connection to the domain controller. So this is NMDC1. I've connected to it using Remote Desktop Connection Manager. It's a standard domain controller. It's 2019 edition. And this particular one, NMDC1, has got Azure AD Connect installed. If we look at the users in this domain, I'm just going to quickly create a new user. So you've got some common names. Some of these guys said they used to be footballers. So a new user is going to join the organization. I'll copy Luke. I believe it's Jesse who's joining. Used to be a footballer, I heard. Well, he's coming to work for us to manage domain controllers for NBM systems. Good guy. He's supposed to be a whiz with domain controllers. I'll set him a password. And he's away. So Jesse's created on-prem in advance of him starting on Monday, which is great. Just have a quick look at the domain controller. It's called NMDC1. You can see it's joined to a domain called NBM Systems. Azure AD Connect is installed, and domain services up and running along with a few other services. And we now have Jesse joining the company, which is great. So if we go back to Azure, and we'll have a look at Azure AD before coming back to investigate some of the options within Azure AD Connect. I'm back in Azure, and so I pinned this tile Azure Active Directory to my dashboard, which you can do. Some of the quick tasks from Azure Active Directory I've also pinned. I could then, if I wanted to, share this dashboard with someone in my organization or externally who's going to manage these services for me. So I can access Azure Active Directory from this tile, or I can use the option on the side to get to exactly the same place. This portal's recently been updated to include these fly out options, which are good. But this is Azure Active Directory. So I'll just quickly confirm that Jesse doesn't exist in my organization. So I'll go to users, and they're alphabetical. So I've got John, no Jesse. I'll just refresh and make sure he's not here. Still not there. Okay, that's good. So if we go back to Azure Active Directory overview, this is the home page for Azure Active Directory, and Microsoft are always updating the portal with new features, and as you can see from this purple banner, they've added security to Azure Active Directory, so have a quick look at that shortly, and there's a link to it there. So on the home page, you can see that the domain is NBM Systems, which is my custom domain that I've brought in. I own that domain. And the addition of Azure Active Directory is Azure AD for 365. On On the right hand side, I can see my role in the organization, which is a global administrator, plus 2 other roles. And I can see that Azure AD Connect Sync is enabled. And the last synchronization was less than an hour ago. If I just go back to the synchronization server, when you install Azure AD Connect, you also get the Azure AD Connect synchronization service. And from here, you can manually run a synchronization, full sync, delta import, delta sync. If I run that, it's fairly quick. Full synchronizations just happened from the domain controller up to Azure. Just go back to Azure. So that last sync less than an hour ago. It does typically take a while for that synchronization to appear in the portal. I'll confirm that just doing that hasn't brought Jesse in yet. I wouldn't imagine it's here yet. It's like a little bit longer than that. Refresh. But still not here yet. Jesse's not joined us yet. It's not been synchronized up to Azure AD. So I can see the synchronization status. That's great. There's a few tasks here which I pinned to the dashboard to create new users, guest users, groups, enterprise apps, or on-prem apps, application registration, and some other capabilities. Lots of great links Microsoft always provide for additional information to specific areas within any of their solutions. And then in the middle, we get what's new, and we can filter what we want to see about what's new in Azure Active Directory. So for example, I could just say I'm only concerned with user authentication, what's new, and it'll tell me just the new items around user authentication. So just looking at some of the menus on the side, that's the overview menu, which is good. I can see recent sign-in activity just straight off the bat. Some of the features will require P1 or P2 and won't be enabled by default. But as we mentioned earlier in the slides, all the free features are readily available just straight out of the bat if you're an Office 365 user, for example. So here's a bunch of users that I've got in my Azure Active Directory, similar that you would have in an on-prem directory, AD. And if I draw your attention to the source of these users, you'll notice that some of them are Azure Active Directory users, which means they were created in Azure AD and they've never existed on-prem. And then we have Windows Server AD users. Another recent footballer, I believe, has joined the company. These are Windows Server AD users, and these have been synchronized, and that's how I can identify which are my on-prem users and which are my cloud users. There are also guest users, which would be added if I invited a B2C or a B2B customer to my organization. So that's the users. Jesse's still not appeared. Okay, he'll be synchronizing as we speak in the background. That's users. Groups, as you would normally expect in an Active Directory environment, users and groups. You get some built-in default groups. So these are the synchronization groups that are part of Azure AD Connect synchronization service running on that domain controller. And if you just go back to users, I'll show you the user that gets created as part of Azure AD Sync, which is this guy, the on-prem directory synchronization service account. And that account is synchronized up from my on-prem Active Directory. I'll go back to the menus. So using relationships, roles and responsibilities. So all the default roles that you get with Azure Active Directory. So you can start building out your IT teams and putting your relevant users in the relevant roles. Global administrator, for example, the owner of the overall subscription. There's a few people in there. So lots of built-in roles, and lets you start assigning roles to specific teams within the organization. This is where we add enterprise applications that we talked about earlier. I think I mentioned 2,800 was the latest count. That's now been increased to over 3,250. So always new apps are being added to Azure Active Directory that are readily available for you to configure and provide access to your users in your organization, either on-prem or cloud users. That's the enterprise applications. Once you've configured your apps, you can then, for example, here's Box. You can configure single sign-in for Box for your users and choose which method of single sign-in you want to use, for example. So that's enterprise apps, app registrations. So here's Azure AD Connect. So in the future, the options for Azure AD Connect and the way you configure some of the identity and access methods will be brought into Azure AD in the portal. But for now, a lot of that configuration is done from within Azure AD Connect, which we'll come back to. So in here, I can see that the synchronization status is enabled, last sync was an hour ago, and password hash sync is enabled. So I'm syncing hashes of passwords from on-prem back to Azure AD, so no passwords were ever stored in the cloud. Sign-ins, I don't have federation or pass-through authentication enabled, and they again are enabled within Azure AD Connect. Custom domain names, which is where I brought my NBM systems domain in, which will be any organization's name. You'd add your custom domain, you'd have access to your MX records, you'd verify those, and then you'd make it your primary domain. It's fairly straightforward. So for example, if I look at this one, I wanted to make it primary, my original domain that you get when you get your free account. You just have it on Microsoft account, and I've just brought mine in. So MDM, tune access, provides premium features. Password reset capability is for the organization as a whole. Do I want to allow self-service password resets for my users? Yes or no? What methods do I want? This is where you set email or phone methods for multi-factor authentication, MFA. And the security new feature, which has just recently been added. So they've just moved all the documentation for security into one location, and you can now do conditional access, ID protection, and access security center from the security blade. Conditional access from default policies, which I have all switched off, as a new feature that's just recently been brought into Azure AD. Let's have a quick look at my users and see if Jesse is in yet. Still hasn't appeared. Okay, so let's go and have a quick look at Azure AD Connect on the domain controller. So here we are, back on the domain controller, NMDC1. We're also connected to NMDC2, but that's just the same. So the domain controller doesn't have Azure AD Connect on, it's more of a failover for my first domain controller. So this one's got Azure AD Connect. When you fire up Azure AD Connect, this is where you configure the synchronization options for your organization. So when you start Azure AD Connect, it's going to stop the synchronization service because you're making changes, and it'll carry on after you've made your changes. So these are some of the settings. When you install it, you'd run through these settings, and the best practice is to accept the defaults unless you have any specific requirements that need the defaults to change. So if we have a quick look at the current config, let's go next, and we can see that Azure Active Directory gives you the directory ID, so we know which Azure AD we're talking about, and that can be found here, the directory ID, so unique ID to confirm which Azure AD I'm synchronizing with, and some information about the options that are enabled and disabled. So I can see that password writeback is enabled, user writeback is disabled, password hash sync is enabled. They are the options. So to customize the options, and it's worth pointing out that each time you go into one of the options, you need to re-authenticate. So a quick look at the synchronization. Confirm my domain, my forest, filtering which use do I want to filter and synchronize up to Azure AD? So pretty much everything. I haven't changed this from the default. I could add built-in if I wanted to. That'll force a change. And then the password synchronization and hash synchronization options. And literally it's just, so it's going to tell you about each one, and then you enable them with a tick box. So password hash sync, I want to enable that so my on-prem users can use the same password for the cloud resources. So Jesse will be able to log into Azure with his on-prem credentials and password right back, and pick the options you require. Once you've made your changes, it'll go off, make the changes, and restart the synchronization service. Okay, so that's going to configure, change, and just go back in and look at the single sign-in settings and where those settings are. Just check Jesse's not appeared while that's been happening. Okay, so you have to go back in again to look at any additional options. Configure. That was the sync options. The single sign-in are in these options, the change user sign-in options, funnily enough. And in we go again to authenticate. And this account that I'm using is my on-prem domain admin account. So again, I can see the password hash sync, pass-through, federation, or don't configure, and to enable single sign-on is simply put a tick in the box. Enter my domain credentials to do that, and then it'll go off and configure single sign-on. I'm not going to do that as I don't have any apps configured for single sign-on, but just to show where that option is now in Azure Active Directory Connect rather than in the portal. Okay, so we can go back out there then, no changes made. Staging mode is where you configure staging. Staging is where you want to make changes and stop the synchronization service. And to configure device options, do I want hybrid Azure AD join? Do I want my devices to write back? Either. So just to show really that Azure AD Connect is more than just a synchronization engine. There's a lot going on in terms of identity and access management options as well. Okay, so I haven't made any changes, it looks like, and go all the way back and just exit. And exit. So the synchronization service will start again. And if I again just go back into the sync service and do another synchronization. That's a success. Doing synchronization. That's a success. Okay. So let's just have a quick look back at Azure AD. Jesse's still not appeared. Let me just pause the video for a second and then I'll come back when Jesse's appeared and we'll have a look at what access he has and whether how we give him access to manage those virtual machines. Okay, so we're back in the Azure Active Directory, and I can see now that Jesse has been synchronized up to my Azure Active Directory. You can see that there's a Windows Server. AD is the source of his account, so I know he's been synchronized from on-prem. So now Jesse can essentially, I can give Jesse access to my virtual machines, to my resource groups, subscription, or individual resources. And as he's going to manage virtual machines, I would simply, as I've got my virtual machines in separate resource groups, you can see that My domain controllers are in a resource group called NMDCVMs, and file servers are in file servers. So I can go to this resource group and give Jesse access to this, and he'll have access to everything within that resource group. So I go to access control, add a role assignment, select a role for Jesse. It's going to be the owner of the resource group, and pick him from my list and save that. That's been added. So now when Jesse goes to log into the portal to manage my virtual machines, logs in for the first time with a, he won't log in with that. Should be okay. I'm now logged into Azure as Jesse. Dismiss that. And if I go to virtual machines, I should see a couple in there. Don't have access. Let's see, all resources. I can see all my resources there. The resource group and DCVC, I can see everything within the resource group, which is great. Both virtual machines and all the associated resources. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight into how to synchronize your on-prem users into Azure AD and assign them permissions to manage your on-prem and cloud resources. So in today's session, we've covered what is Azure Active Directory, who would use Azure Active Directory, some of the pricing, features, different editions, and how we would use Azure AD to perform migrations of on-prem users to Azure Active Directory. My name's Nigel Mullings, and today we've been talking about Azure Active Directory. I hope that's given you a bit of an insight into some of the capabilities of Azure Active Directory. My contact details are on the screen. Please feel free to reach out to me if you require any further information.